Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 40th anniversary of bike lanes in Davis, the first bike lanes in America. My name is Ted Bueller. I'm a graduate student in the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, and it's been my pleasure to have funding through the University of California Transportation Center to interview these people and the other people who aren't here tonight over the last couple of years, and to talk with them about the amazing process that they went through to get bike lanes developed in Davis. And I'm going to give a few words of introduction, and then we will proceed with a fairly open forum for about an hour, where we have a series of questions to ask these people to tell their stories, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions from the floor at the end. First, I want to thank the sponsors for this event, the City of Davis, Bob Weir, Bob Clark, Bob Bowen, and I think in the House we have Mayor Greenwald and Councilman Haystack. Are you here? Want to wave? There we go. And then we'd like to recognize the family members of people who are here. If you all want to wave when you're down there on the floor. We have all of Frank Child's children, Bill, Tracy, Dodie, and Matt. And I'm hoping we have Lois Spafford, Susan Meyer, Terrence Lott, Susie Aronson. We know Susie's here. And Dave Kendall. And we'd also like to recognize the people that brought bicycling to Davis that have passed on and can't be here. Emil Mrack, Kathleen Green, Ed Spafford, Jim Meyer, Eve Child, Norm Woodbury, Ralph Aronson, Dale Lott, and Fred Kendall. And then also a special recognition for a number of the pioneers who would have liked to have been here, but they had other commitments. Dave Pels and Art Eichhorn are fishing. Maynard Skinner is traveling in Norway. Rick Blunden is on a 2-week motorcycle tour. Jim Calloway is in Tahoe. And Kent Gill doesn't much like to drive. He'd prefer to bike, so he's still in Bend, Oregon. So the people that we have here tonight, from left to right, from right to left, we have Dwayne Copley, who was hired on at Davis Public Works in 1965 because they needed more civil engineers on staff to begin designing bike lanes. And we have Frank Child, who, with his wife Eve, traveled to Amsterdam and came back to Davis and made sure that Davis became a lot more like Amsterdam than it had been before. And Donna Lott, who came to Davis with her husband Dale in 1965 and read a letter in the Enterprise from Frank Child that said, "Davis needs bike lanes," and pretty soon she was banging on Frank's door. And Mel Ramey, who is a civil engineer for something like 40 years at UC Davis, and he did a lot of the design work, transferring the Davis designs for bike lanes into models for the state of California and for the U.S. And at the end, we have Bob Summer, who studied who is a psychology professor for 40 some odd years and is still teaching. He was busy this week grading papers or something. And he's done research on every element of bicycling that anybody can imagine. And just one more warm-up. We discovered that the mayor of Davis in 1966, who we'd read about in the 1966 papers, was still alive, and he was up in Bend, Oregon. His name is Kent Gill. If you're passing through, you might stop by and say hi. But he wrote us a very nice note when he said that he wasn't able to come down here for the forum. He said, "When my daughter Kathy and her family returned to Davis in 2002, she found that the Davis bike lane system gave her school-age sons a mobility with safety that had not been at all available to them in Puyallup, Washington. So bikeways for them became an important element of Davis, of life in Davis." So the work that everybody has done is being passed down from generation to generation. We are all fortunate enough to benefit from them, and I hope that what we hear tonight will inspire us to go on and do the same for future generations with whatever aspect of our communities we feel strongly about.
Okay, sure.
I think, let me ask a question first.
If you want.
We'll give you the answer.
Okay, well, this is an open forum, so, but we're hoping to have a bit of conversation. And so we're going to start off asking with, what was your concept for bicycling in Davis 40 years ago when you were here and you were working with the bike lanes and trying to make them as good as possible? What sorts of things were you thinking about, and what were your interests?
I'm going to follow the policies of the Bush administration and stay on message. Okay, yeah. I'm going to start about bike lanes as local research. From the start, the Davis bike lanes have been a team effort. What?
Like an ice cream cone.
Okay, the bike lanes have been a team effort. First came the activists, Frank and Eva Child, Donna and Dale Lott, Bob Powell, who went around obtaining signatures on petitions and lobbying city council, and successive city councils, starting with Maynard Skinner and Norm Woodbury, leadership supported the idea. Dave Pells and his city staff of engineers, including Dwayne Copley, implemented the policy, starting with the 3rd Street bike path in 1967. Support from the Davis Police Department was essential for enforcement and rider education in the schools. And if it hadn't been for their support, and I know there was some resistance in the very beginning, the bike lanes would have become double parking lanes in the town. I remember the legendary Officer Dasher, who visited all the schools doing rider education. That was a time when Davis had its own city licenses, and the fees from the licenses were used to support the bicycle police. My daughter, when she was in 3rd grade, commented that Officer Dasher did a better job with rider education than he did with drug education that he did later. That my role, along with several other UCD faculty, including Mel Ramey from civil engineering, Bill Adams from physical education, and Dale Lott from psychology, was the R&D, the research and development for the bike lanes. Taking macadam from the automobile had not been done anywhere in the U.S. The extensive bike lane networks in the 19th century, and Davis didn't have the first bike. There were bike lanes in the 19th century. The Coney Island one had about 17 lanes in it, but they'd all been replaced, turned into highways. And the hegemony of the automobile, you really want me to do this? Okay. Okay. Oh, you can't hear. Okay. In 1967, Davis created the only on-street bike lane in the country. It sounds impressive, but it was only a few bollards, paint lines, and street signs on 3rd Street, backed by city council policies and enforcement by city police. My view is that this was responsible for a lot of other environmental innovations in Davis. We were pioneers in front yard recycling and many other sort of green policies. The energy code went there. My feeling was that the bicycle was responsible for this, that when people are on bikes, your relationship to your surroundings is very different. You're vulnerable rather than going down the street in a kind of encased steel tank spewing out noxious gases. R&D, research and development, is essential for any innovation to succeed. Unless they are very, very lucky, nobody gets it right the first time. And that fine-tuning is essential for long-term success. That was the role played by Judy and Mike Corbett in Village Homes and Lawrence Halprin at Sea Ranch. If the designers had built the community, had walked away from the communities after they were built out, the results would not have been nearly as successful as they were today. Let's see where we are. Yeah.
Bob,
Yeah.
let's move on to Mel and the others.
Sure.
And then you can continue with the next question.
Well, thank you very much. I came to Davis in 1967. I didn't realize it. When I came here, it was a bike path. So I guess it was built a few months before I got here. When I was a graduate student back in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I do recall that I would ride my bicycle from my home to Carnegie Mellon University, and that was on the Pittsburgh street. So when I got here and saw that it was a place that's flat, they had a bike lane, and there were a lot of people riding bikes all over the campus. And where I lived here on campus, where I lived was very close to the campus, and I get involved in a lot of athletic sorts of things. It was a natural for me to want to ride a bike. I came as a young, green behind the ears assistant professor, and as a result, we all are required, as you know, to publish or perish, and I had no intention of perishing. And it came to my attention that the Federal Highway Administration was putting money out to take a look at bicycle pathways. And I used to work for a state highway department when I first got out of undergraduate school, worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Highways. So I said, I like to ride bikes. I got to get money to try to support research so I can get tenure and live around here. So why don't I go after this money? So I was successful in writing a proposal, and I asked Bob and Donna and Bill Adams and others who have been mentioned if they would like to be party of this research project. And the idea was to try to set standards for the bicycle lanes in the United States, which I thought, sure, why not? Davis had bike lanes, as far as I could tell. They've been there forever. I didn't ask. I didn't try to study the history. But I noticed they were there. They had a width. They had a paving and everything. These are the kind of things that civil engineers do. So we worked in collaboration with a engineering consulting firm, Delu, Cather and Associates. And jointly, we did some really, really interesting work. Essentially, we were looking at how the human interface and the mechanical interface worked with the infrastructure interface. And so the human interface, we had Professor Adams, who was an exercise physiologist. And the human interface, we had psychologists, Dale Lott, Donna Lott, Bob Summer. And the civil engineering and the infrastructure interface was me and working with some of our students. And that was an interesting interdisciplinary way to come together. And I think we all benefit from it. When I say we did some real interesting research, we were actually getting, you see the mobs of people riding, and Bob was interested in the personal space that you have when you ride adjacent to somebody. I think all of us know about personal space. If somebody gets too close to you, you start backing away. When you ride adjacent to a person, if you get too close to them, they start to squeeze away. So we could figure out how many people could ride abreast and how wide the bike path would have to be. We needed to know what that, we called it shy distance was. And so we actually went out and measured these kinds of things with different groups of people, and we knew that that was going to be a function of speed. It was going to be a function of actually the age of the people. And sometimes if you were riding next to a low barrier, like just a painted line, you would ride closer to it than a curb that might be 3 or 4 inches, than a wall that might be 4 feet to a building. That shy distance would change. And so we were mapping these things. We also measured how much energy a person would have to put out when they rode up different bicycle grades, with the idea that if you're going to put a bicycle pathway system in a senior community, that is a different population than if you put it at a university campus. So we needed to know what were the limits of the human interface. So we were doing all these things. Some of it represented fundamental questions that we found in the literature. And for example, we could not find, we find that when people ride the bicycle, the physiologists say that the minimum energy expenditure for riding a bike happens whenever you pedal at 60 revolutions a minute, excuse me. 60 revolutions a minute. 60 a second, that would be pretty good. So we went and watched the people on campus riding around and in the street. They were riding below that. We go look at a high-performance bicyclists, like racers. They're riding above that. So what's going on? How come the physiologists are saying one thing, but the people that are actually doing it are doing something different? So we actually went and mapped what it would take, how much energy it would take to ride up a steep grade when you're pedaling at 30 revolutions a minute, and how many it would take if you were riding up a steep grade at 120 revolutions a minute. And we actually were able to find some people that would try to do these things. So it was an exciting time, and we built some models, and we did the usual engineering things. But as far as I was concerned, it was a nice way to get involved in an interdisciplinary action, because a lot of what we do for everything is cutting across all of the disciplines. And one of the things that Bill Adams had all of us do is he was really concerned about the role of air pollution. So we actually would go into the lab over in Hickey Gym, sit on a bicycle ergometer, pedal for 1 hour at a metronome speed, tick-tock, 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 for an hour, breathing with an apparatus that covered up everything but everything on your face, and you didn't know whether you were getting air or ozone. And they were trying to measure when we say we, our subjects, what we were doing. And this turned out to be very important information that we still use today in trying to find out about putting bicyclists in these polluted environments that we live in. It's a fascinating time. I remember it nicely. One final thing. We wrote a number of papers and a number of reports. I kept those reports for 25 years. No one asked me for any of those reports. I retired. I said, well, nobody asked me in 25 years, so nobody wants the reports. I threw them away. 6 weeks later, I got an email from a person in Florida that had heard about some of this, and they wanted a copy. So you never know. Thank you.
Well, I'll take it back a little bit further. When we came to town in 1965, my husband had been riding a bike to the University of Seattle, or of Washington, up the hill, a pretty steep hill, and then coming down a pretty steep hill for some years. So we came to Davis, and there were grown-ups riding on bikes most everywhere, and it was flat. But it was dangerous. People were riding against traffic. They didn't have lights on at night. A motorist never knew where the bicyclist was going to be, and vice versa. I mean, there was, as someone said, sometimes you'd have a platoon of junior high students just filled up the streets. And so one of the things that we did read Frank Child's letter, one of his numerous letters, saying that his family had a wonderful experience with bicycles in Amsterdam and other places in the Netherlands, and that Davis was just as flat and the weather was a whole lot better, and we really should do something about this. Well, we were a couple of young activists, and we called him up and said, that's a good idea, let's do that. And that began the ad hoc citizen study committee that there were about 3 families of us that, were spearheaded the thing, and my introduction to Davis was getting everybody's list of progressive type people and calling them and saying, would you walk your block and carry a petition? And rather quickly, we got 10% of the voters with name, address, are they a voter, do they drive a car, are they a motorist, are they a bicyclist? Took it down to city council, all proud of ourselves. And of course, there were only 2 out of the 5 votes on the city council who thought this was a good idea. But we were determined, and I had drawn these lines on the map that were arterials and collector streets, so you could go from point A to point B. There was talk of trying to get bikes shunted off on side streets and not allowed on arterials, and of course that never would have worked with college students anyway, but we kept having meetings every month, somebody's home, and we would invite the police chief, and then we invite the city planner, and then the city manager. They all tell us it's impossible, it's not a good idea, don't do this thing, but we kept persisting. The Davis Enterprise was just transitioning from a weekly to a daily paper. And so we got 2 stories out of every meeting. We would write up what we were going to talk about, and then we would write up how it turned out, you know. So, and we recruited more support as we went. And finally, 2 candidates for city council, Norm Woodbury and Maynard Skinner, came to us and said, would you consider endorsing us? We like your ideas. And we said, sure. So anyway, I should not carry on too long, but we did, they won. We got the first authorization from the city council to figure out how to make it work. Fred Kendall's son is here, and Fred and his family went out and did some of the ad hoc riding side by side and figuring out, you know, just from experience, what's going to work. And so we built from the ground up in that sense. I was pleased to be part of the study group that worked on the Delu Cather report. My husband and I were bicycle research associates for 10 years, and that was the only contract we ever got, but got to give a lot of free advice. But anyway, it was a fine time, and I should let Frank talk about the earlier part that got started before we came to town.
I guess the first thing I need to remind myself of, and which I think you folk might want to know, the idea of riding bicycles for either recreation or for health reasons, or just to have a lot of fun. That's not a new idea, I think. So what I do think is the case, however, my family lived for a time in the Netherlands, in Scheveningen. I can't pronounce that word. Near The Hague. Near The Hague in Holland, where people rode bicycles. When we got here, it was pretty clear that city of Davis had a lot of things going for it as far as riding bicycles is concerned. It's flat. And there are a lot of young people associated with universities, not to mention the public schools, but the older folk rode bicycles as well. Anyhow, it was my wife who urged me to get involved politically in the movement to make bicycle paths available to all of us. I remember very well that it was her idea, and I think, you might say, she played the role of Moses, and I was the spokesman, Aaron, who was able to publicize her ideas. Yeah, I don't know if you go back and look in the newspapers of that time. We didn't get a lot of publicity in the Davis Enterprise, but the Woodland Democrat gave us a lot of stuff. And they published letters to the editor, usually someone who was criticizing the idea of bike paths, and my answering letter saying what a wonderful idea it would be to have bicycle paths. Anyhow, eventually, you got bicycle paths. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I hope you will be grateful to my wife for being not the first person who ever thought of riding bicycles, but the one who brought the idea to Davis that there should be bicycle paths in this town, which is really made for bicycles.
First, I'd like to, I worked for the city of Davis for 32 years, been retired for 10. I came in 1965. I think my wife is sitting back in the back of the room. She helped me again today by driving so I could get close, so I make it easy for me to move in my stuff here. So continued support. Also, I want to, the perspective I bring is that of Fred Kendall and Art Eichhorn and Dave Pelz, who were instrumental in all this bicycle facilities, and for Jim Calloway, who was the city attorney, who is the one that shepherded the legislation and got that through. Well, he didn't shepherd it. He created the legislation that was adopted thanks to Fred Marler and Assemblyman Johnson, who put the law through. SB 1299 was the law that they put through in 1967, which resulted in the bike lanes. By the way, I've gone through the city council minutes for that time, and originally they were called paths, and then kind of the lanes name grew. And if you see what I wrote about that, you'll see that word used in the various intermixed. I came in 65, and because my father had been on a city council in another city, I was interested in what was going on in the city and wanted to be involved here. So I used to go to the city council meetings. So I used to listen to these guys when they came and talked before the council. And I wasn't directly involved initially in bike lanes. I was involved in other projects like the construction of Russell Boulevard along here in front of the university. That was the main project at that time. And by the way, in the room are city staff members that are responsible for the current bicycle system, Will Marshall and Bob Weir and Bob Clark. And it's good they're here. Roxanne Namazi. So the city facilities are in good hands. There was lots of work that went into this, and I'll wait and talk about some of the facilities later on. If some of you have questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them later on. So. Oh, I want to say one more thing. Starting in the late 60s on through until 1985 or 86 somewhere, I was the engineer who worked with the planners in all the new facilities or developments in town. So a lot of the bicycle facilities you see sort of fingered their way through went through my fingers in some way and encouraged those happening. And that job is now well done by Will Marshall.
Thank you all. Next question is, when you were, say, or you could of course answer whatever question you like, but if, the question at hand is, 5 to 10 years into the bike lane process, when you saw that the movement that you started was growing rapidly, what was your impression of it, and how did you and your household use it, and how did it affect your lives and that sort of thing?
Well, I saved tens of thousands of dollars when my children were growing up. We only needed one car for 3 kids, and they rode everywhere. We weren't chauffeurs either. We had our own time to ourselves. And it was a wonderful thing that you could just, in fact, my grandchildren ride the bike path system now, going to school, to the pool, to everywhere. And it's been a feature of the town. Davis became known as Bicycle City USA. Other cities vied for the title, but people came from all over the world to see the bicycles here. Bicycles became the city logo, and people became justifiably proud of the system that existed.
Well, I found a couple of things very, very interesting. A couple of years later, after we finished our study and rewritten our reports, I would start to go to other parts of the country and see some of the ideas that we put forward that were in our report starting to show up, and that was a really, really good feeling. And I actually went out into another city and I measured the width of the bike path, and I found somebody and said, you know, what was the design standard? And they said, oh, this is the width that we get. We read a report somewhere where this is the width we should get if 3 people should be riding abreast, so 2 could be riding and talking and another person could pass. That made me feel good. The other thing that I thought was very interesting is that if you noticed on the campus, there are 2 bicycle circles. And those bicycle circles came up as, it wasn't part of our study, but the consulting engineering firm was looking at a way to try to do things with traffic. And so they put in those the bicycle circles, especially one at Hutchinson. And I remember going out with the principal from the firm, a guy named Dan Smith, and they went out and they put they glued the concrete circle things that you see around there. And I saw him 15 years later, he came back and said, those are the same ones. They are. They're the same ones that were put down there. And the other thing that was really interesting that Davis did, and now you see everywhere, is having a left turn lane that's in against the curb. So as you remember, if you come down Anderson Road coming towards the campus, there's that left lane turn. And there's actually a merged lane that comes out so the bikes can weave from the bicycle lane that's on the right side over to the inside lane to make a left turn. And when that was being proposed, that was very controversial. People were worried about that mixing, that the bikes are going to get knocked off and all of this, that, and the other. And we remember going up on the top of the dormitory that was there, taking photographs so we could actually watch and see how that was going. And that's worked well, and you see those kind of left turn bike lanes all over the place. So seeing a lot of that, you don't realize when you're doing things like this that it's really going to take hold, and that's been very important. And my final thing is that my children benefited from riding their bikes. We were just telling somebody today that the neat thing about Davis is that my children rode their bicycles to kindergarten. So they were kindergartners, and they were riding their bikes safely without us having to go with them. And I always thought that was one of the nice things about making this community a very livable community. And in many regards, it still has that flavor.
As a young parent at the time, I second Mel's appreciation of the fact that we didn't need to be chauffeurs and the kids had a lot more freedom, and it wasn't a time you worried about them getting kidnapped by somebody, so that, you know, it was a safer time and place in that way. One of the things I remember is that after about 10 years, I decided to go back to graduate school and community development, and I took some courses in transportation kind of things and wrote a survey paper of how Davis bicycle facilities were working. You know, we had a meeting at the Roundhouse to get some citizen input, and there was enough interest in it that I decided, well, I was going to be changing careers from social work to planning, basically, and went to work for the Air Resources Board after I sat next to somebody at a planners meeting named Ann Garrity, who happens to be working with Walk California now, having been my boss for many years at the Air Resources Board, since I signed on to work in transportation alternatives, not just bikes, but also buses and carpools and carpool lanes and alternative work weeks. And so my personal experience as an activist led me to really make a career out of transportation. And so those of you who are in the student phase, you might think about it's not just a way to get from here to there, but you can reduce emissions at the same time.
Yeah. My family moved to Davis 1963. When we came to Davis, I've been corrected. 62. When we came to Davis, we sold one of our cars and bought 6 bicycles.
Along the lines of the others, I only needed one car. You know, we only had one car initially, and so it worked well. Either I rode my bike to work across the city to the corporation yard or to City Hall. You know, or if I needed the car, my wife rode the bike with the kids, and so on. And it is a wonderful system from that standpoint. And hearkening back to the studies that Mel and Donna and Bob have mentioned, the Delu Cather report, they did 2 reports. One was on transportation and one on bicycles. And that's where the rotaries came in and the left-hand turn lane, and that was 1972. It was time enough after the initial bike lanes had been in to study it further. And Dan Smith worked real closely with not only Dave Pells and Dave Pells at that time, because Fred Kendall had left, and Lou Weiss, who was the campus engineer, and they worked and come up with lots of ideas and information that could be used to make decisions for engineers. So those were very important things.
The next question is for Frank and Donna. When you were first involved with the Citizens Bicycle Study Group, what are some of the things that you did in order to raise bicycles in the public profile, and what kind of a response did you get?
Well, mainly we had neighborhood meetings. After I mentioned we had this survey and everybody was willing to sign the petition, but nothing was happening with the city council. So we just persisted as a small group that we would have a public meeting every month, often at like the school room there on Anderson Road, and just kept pushing at it. I mean, it seemed like a good idea, and we just didn't give up on it. And if the more people that got involved, the more support the idea got. But really, it came in a situation where a lot of people rode bikes already, but they were becoming discouraged. The first stoplight had just come at Russell and B. Russell Boulevard had been widened without any provision for bicycles, although there was a bike path adjacent along the campus. And it was real persistence in staying with this that I think brought it up to the political level where we had candidates who wanted to push it. And afterwards, the opportunity to see how it worked and to study and publicize in little papers. Bob and my husband Dale couldn't get any money to study it. Once there was a $1,000 grant, from a health agency, but they would assign papers to their students. And I remember there was a site on campus where the bike path went under LaRue, and it was the worst place on campus for accidents. And looking at it, it turned out the grade was too steep, and people would try to build up speed going downhill, and then they would crash into the concrete wall. It was too fast to control. So, there were practical little things where you did studies that would improve the operations, and I don't know, I think the main thing was persistence, but also a climate of there were people in Davis, a lot of young families that come in. It was pretty progressive. We didn't have a lot of backbiting stuff going on. And as Bob mentioned, other innovations came along as well. I don't know that bike lanes can take the whole, credit for that, but it was the people who were here that wanted to get recycling started, solar power and house orientation, those kind of things that later became state standards, just like the bike design things were adopted by Caltrans and the federal highways. So we were an incubator for ideas, and wherever you are, that you have a group of people who are willing to back up these things, not just talk about them, but really just stay with it. I think that was the secret here.
I think the interesting thing about the whole exercise is that there really was never any great deal of opposition to the bike lanes, except along some portion of the local police force. Why they were opposed to it, I never did understand. But by and large, I think the people in the city of Davis were kind of at least open to the idea. But nothing happened. The things finally happened when we got involved in politics, alas. I forgot what year it was, but there were at least two people running for city council who were endorsed the idea of bike paths. And that was Norm Woodbury and Maynard Skinner. And as soon as the election was over, the next city council meeting, one of these two people got introduced into the city council an experimental program to introduce bike lanes in the city of Davis. The other thing that was important, the things that were important that tipped the public point of view, at least as near as you could tell of what was the public point of view, was one thing was this election of two new city council members who were willing to make this an issue, and the other was persistence on, my part. If you go back and look in the newspaper, I had public debate going on through letters to the editor in the Woodland paper for about a year, and these letters really, not masterpieces of modern literature, but they are a fine example, I think, of what little people can do if they're persistent.
I'd like to say something about that. It is an extreme pleasure to be sitting next to one of the parents of all the bike lanes in the United States.
Next is for the engineers and researchers. What were the sorts of challenges that you faced when you were going from the first bike lanes that were developed to when you came up with the eventual standard that was used across the country? And what did you learn?
The researchers also faced quite a bit of opposition from a surprising source. That was the League of American Wheelmen. There was an engineer named John Forrester, who had a Darwinian perspective, and that bike lanes they saw as segregating cyclists at the side of the road. And so we would, after the initial research, a number of us went around the country talking about bike lanes. And these people would be there sort of in opposition. And they saw themselves as sort of serious cyclists, And we were just trying to get things for school children, and we weren't macho enough for them. But the application was local. When we went to Eugene, Oregon to propose bike lanes, we had to deal with the river and getting a bike bridge across the river, using the alleyways for cyclists. In Woodland, the only interest we could find in bike lanes was from one of the school principals. And so they were able to get the first bike lane in Woodland leading to his school. So let me pass it on to Mel.
Yeah, one of the challenges I found was I had conversations with the people at Caltrans to try to see if we could get some of these things in the proper place by the side of highways and whatnot. And so one of the things we went over and talked to them about was getting across the Yolo Causeway, because the way you got across the Yolo Causeway way back then was that you actually had to ride down on the ground part. The ground part used to be US 40, and you could ride that all the way across and get across. I've done it a couple of times. The old pavement from US Highway 40 was still there. It may still be there. But you couldn't use that pathway in the wintertime because it would flood. And so we were saying, and then they wouldn't let bicycles ride on the bridge, and it wasn't really safe. So we tried to convince them, and we didn't get anywhere. Also, the overpass going over Mace Boulevard, over Interstate 80, we try to say that you should use that and let people get over the railroad tracks, and then it be some kind of a ramp or something going down that. And they said, no way that you would ever do that. So what they came up with, if some of you remember, stairs. Remember the stairs? And so you ride down the bike path, and you want to get up there, you get off your bike, and you carry or push your bike up the stairs, and you go over the other side. It was very a warm feeling for me when they reconstructed the Mace Boulevard overpass, and we saw that they actually put real ramps so people could ride up and down that. And that was what we were talking about.
That took considerable persistence on the part of the city.
Dwayne was in the middle of all of that, believe me. And the other thing that was also warming is whenever they actually built the bike lane across the causeway and put a real physical barrier so that cars could not come over and hit the bicyclists as you go across that pathway. That was a big move, and Caltrans had really turned. They actually had a bicycle coordinator and stuff, and over there in Sacramento we had talked. That was a challenge that was a real surprise to me, that those transportation people would not see the role that the bicycles could play. As some other people said, it looked like it was a competing thing rather than something that would help move people around. There's enough people around that want to do this, that want to commute, and if we can make the commute paths really accommodating, people will use them. I was just out in Atlantic City last week. I was down in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm just amazed at the places now that are building their infrastructure with bike lanes in place and with left turn lanes and all of the stuff that we see here in Davis.
Influenced by Davis?
Oh, I think, yeah, I mean, we're looking at, 30 years ago, and now it's become comfortable. But the original part of it was what was really done here. And some of the ideas that were here almost from the very beginning, we're seeing as standard operations everywhere. It's the same design standard when you go look at it. And I think that's pretty important.
I was just thinking that maybe Dwayne could tell us a little bit about the more recent innovations, because I'm blown away. It's so much more complete and wonderful than we envisioned at the beginning, with tunnels under and bridges over and the circuit of the city. You want to say a few words on it, Dwayne?
Yes, but I'd like to go back to the Delu Cather study. And a couple of things. Sometime long before my time, somebody decided that collector streets in town ought to have a 50-foot curb-to-curb dimension. Now, collector streets in some other communities were 48 feet. That would allow 2 lanes and parking. And it's 50-foot curb-to-curb, which is what the downtown streets have. And that's very important, because with that configuration, you can have 2 travel lanes and 2 bike lanes and parking. And that way, theoretically, everybody's happy. It wasn't so easy on the secondary streets, and the first one that really came into conflict because there was so many bicycles on it was Anderson Road. And Anderson Road is a 64-foot curb-to-curb planned as 4 12-foot lanes and 2 8-foot parking lanes. And the problem there is if you put in bike lanes, what do you do to the roadway capacity? Well, that same Delu Cather study came up with, well, they didn't come up with, but they identified 2-way left turn lanes on that kind of street would provide adequate capacity, at least for Davis. And I'm going to go aside for a minute. Friday, I drove home from the American Public Works Association meeting in Sacramento with a fellow, Jim Ray, Sr., who invented the 2-way left turn lane. They were invented in Sacramento. So Delu Cather picked up, anyway, he's a great guy. And the Delu Cather study came up and said, hey, use this, and then you can put bike lanes in so that it's a center turn lane, 2 travel lanes, 2 bike lanes, and still have your parking. And that fact meant that we could put bike lanes on the most traveled streets, except for the major streets. And that I identified in the Delu Cather report was it was problematic for bicyclists to be on major streets, and those because of the higher speeds. And so bike paths were put in with the assumption that you probably would never put bicycle lanes on that. But over the years, we became much more comfortable with bicyclists on major streets. There's a parking emergency lane. You can mark that. And also, not all the major street connections were in, so you can mark those on the streets that wide enough, and you're not worried about it. So back on, the Greenbelt system is incredible, and as I indicated earlier, I participated in a lot of those discussions, and some of that led to the perimeter Greenbelt around the community, and some of you will ride on that, like the one leading from the community and the campus into South Davis. And it was fun. That idea of a crossing there was from the late 60s, but then growth stopped in South Davis. So we hung on to the idea, a report done by Lampman Associates, a firm that no longer exists, and we watched out for that, and as some development later on occurred, we made sure that those folks, that idea of a pathway along Pewter Creek, ultimately as part of the perimeter trail, happened. And then we could talk about the crossings of Interstate 80 if you want to later on.
Could I just say one?
Yeah, let's go Frank first.
Just one quick thing on a street that was too narrow. The old retrofitting bicycles into an existing grid of streets is challenging when they're narrow. And 8th Street between B and the railroad was such a street that they had parking on there as well as 2 lanes of travel, but there were a lot of bicyclists there all the time because it was a major corridor. So this was a political thing.
And it had the 40-foot curb-to-curb
Right.
dimension.
Thank you. I didn't know the exact width.
Well, or narrower.
Or narrower. It was the narrowest street in town and one of the few cross streets that everyone used. And so we, as advocates, went to the city council and asked that parking be removed. And well, the landowners who rented those little old houses said, no, we can't rent our houses without parking in front. So they came with a compromise. Well, there would be no parking there from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night. Well, of course, nobody moved their car at 7, and people rode the bikes at night. And so eventually, parking was banned on that narrow little set of streets, so there could be bike lane continuity. But that's again a place where you have to have political persistence in order to solve some of those problems. And getting downtown in general had a number of those decision points that came up later as the system developed and people wanted to go downtown, but it was hard to do it and kind of dangerous.
What I was about to say, if you have public support for the bike paths, it's wonderful. If you don't, if you have opposition, it's a chronic problem of public debate and having somebody who's a gadfly, like myself, to carry on the arguments in the local newspaper for sometimes quite a while before you get any action. But you know, after a while, you know when you're being successful. I knew we were being successful after, I don't know how long, when the city council or somebody, whoever is responsible, voted to remove parking on 5th Street between, what is it, C Street? Between C and the other side of the railroad tracks. There used to be parking, except on the railroad tracks, of course. But when there was that gap in the bicycle lane on 5th Street, well, I knew that the new era had really arrived when the city council voted to remove parking on 5th Street between the campus and the other side of the railroad tracks.
One little correction, that was 3rd Street.
3rd Street, sorry.
Might have been 8th Street.
What?
No, it was
Okay.
It was 3rd and 8th, both.
whatever.
It's okay. And well, one last question from me, and then we have about 15 minutes for questions from the floor. Hopefully there's a floor mic, and if there isn't, just walk up to the stage. The acoustics are here, and here are good, but you'll just have to speak up. My last question is, what do you have to say to all these people out here who are all very interested in building bike lanes, either in their own community or in this community? What's the take-home message from what you guys did 40 years ago to what they can do now, and what we want the world like in the next what we want the world to look like in the next 40 years?
Well, I return to that little theme that I was developing before about fine-tuning, because we tried many things in Davis that didn't work. And we, like sidewalk bike paths, there were a whole, I remember them all around. And
it cost a lot of money, too.
I know, and they didn't work. And so we did away with them, which is fine. And same thing on Sycamore. There was this thing that looked so beautiful of building a bike lane next to the curb and then allowing parking on the other side of the bike lane. This was great while people were on it, and when I used to show pictures of that in cities all over, they loved